I'll start by setting up positive motivation. And we try to develop those minds of refuge, confidence, or faith, and bodhicitta. Seeing the efficacy of the Buddha's wisdom, its validity in our own lives, recognizing our need to turn toward valid sources of refuge and away from merely temporary, ordinary sources. And our wish to accomplish for ourselves the Buddha's enlightenment. Thinking of that desire as being not for oneself, but to create the capacity to be of perfect benefit. Countless sentient beings. We establish these minds of faith and refuge and bodhicitta as the motivation.
Say, Venerable, is it possible to turn your volume up a little bit?
Sure, yeah, the microphone's maybe a bit far away today. I try to keep it out of frame just for vanity.
Thanks, that did it.
All right. So we covered in the previous class, which is on YouTube if you want to circle back, we covered the first two contemplations in this section, day 209 and day 210. So we have day 211 to begin with. And in these contemplations, Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe are expounding on similar themes of expanding on our own renunciation, deepening our renunciation. We mentioned in the previous class on this section that, in a way, renunciation begins even on the small scope, because there are actions of body, speech, and mind that we might have, come to enjoy or see as useful or beneficial in certain circumstances, like engaging in aggression or what have you. And we give those up on the small scope. when we understand deeply the law of cause and effect, the law of karma, and we understand that the motivation of a small scope practitioner is to avoid the worst kinds of suffering that exist within cyclic existence. So, even at that stage, for most people, it becomes necessary to turn away from. I mean, I would say, essentially for everyone, to turn away from things that we might normally do that might be creating the karmic causes and conditions for lower realm rebirths. And all we're doing now on the middle scope is extending that and trying to recognize that that's not good enough in and of itself, that there's a certain value, a certain efficacy in avoiding the lower realms, but it isn't a good in and of itself, as it might be thought of by if a practitioner were to stay on the level of the small scope, they might regard avoiding lower realm rebirths as an intrinsic good. But the view on the middle scope is more subtle. The view on the middle scope is directed at understanding that upper realm rebirths, good rebirths, are still within cyclic existence and therefore are still conditioned by suffering. And so we have to really just carry on this process of renunciation that we began. Renunciation is turning away from suffering. And so we, if we master, hypothetically, if we master the small scope, we've turned away from creating the causes and the conditions for the worst kinds of suffering. But we might see as good creating the causes and the conditions for lesser forms of suffering, less overt forms of suffering. And that's still problematic from the Buddhist point of view, because if we continue to create the causes and the conditions indefinitely for just lesser suffering, then that's what we'll get. We'll get lesser suffering, but we won't get no suffering. And it, unavoidably, it would be really impossible to only ever experience those lesser sufferings. We might be able to create powerful causes and conditions over a period of time where a good number of upper realm rebirths, even in a succession, become possible. But it, we can't really say that it could happen forever and ever and ever for billions and billions and trillions of, you know, quote unquote years, which is, just a made up way of thinking about time. At some point, we would begin once again to create the causes and the conditions for lower realm rebirths. And then we would kind of, not start from zero, but, that's kind of why for us so far, cyclic existence has been beginningless, is because until we abandon even creating the causes for upper realm rebirths, um, those upper realm rebirths happen. And then at some point, we lose the ability to maintain that. And then we fall back down and then we come back up, and it just sort of keeps cycling. So we have to refine our understanding of suffering, and we have to deepen our renunciation and turn away from even the subtler sufferings. And that's what we are doing in the middle scope. That's the job of a middle scope practitioner from the Mahayana perspective. Any thoughts or questions? I don't know if you read the previous contemplations or.
Yeah, I read the previous ones. I'm wondering if you could give a simple example of a more subtle um, suffering.
So, when we say that a low scope practitioner, what they see as suffering, as the really problematic suffering, is just rebirth in the hungry ghost realm, the spirit, the animal realm, and the hell realm. That's really all that they're trying to do, is avoid creating those karmic causes and conditions. They don't see a problem with the human realm, and they certainly don't see a problem with the God realm, the form and formless realms, any of the quote unquote upper realm rebirths. So all of the things that we experience that we don't enjoy are all of those, the idea, sickness, aging, just separating from the body again and again, meeting with what we find unpleasant, being prevented from joining with what we enjoy, all of these, just headaches and cancer and grief and all of the things, and in terms of the upper realms, the demigods, they have jealousy and they're fighting with, the gods, and then the gods are, you know, um, relatively intoxicated with, but they say that at the end of their lives, they may not really experience suffering until then, but toward the end of their life, the power of the body diminishes, the luster of the body diminishes, and they have some clairvoyant powers, and they see that they're going to fall back down because they're at the very top of what's possible, and that they know that there's only additional suffering waiting for them. So that's an example of being separated from what one would not wish to be separated from, and an example of death. Um, so compared to the intense oppressive sufferings of the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm, those are subtler. Those are, and even, Buddhism would say, even just um, the afflictions, even just the arise, even just the fact that we still have the stains of the afflictions in the mind, and therefore we give rise to dissatisfaction, we give rise to jealousy and covetousness and ill will. Those are very painful states of mind, for the person in which they are arising. And then, of course, they perpetuate, they give rise to actions that are unskillful, which perpetuates suffering uh, in the longer term. So,
Thank you. So is it then karma that even if you have led a positive, creative um, life, that in the human realm, that karma can throw you back into the animal realm, say, even if you haven't accrued negative karma in that lifetime? I think it's probably impossible, but that's what's doing it, is karma that's ripening.
yeah, at the moment of the death of an ordinary sentient being, karma definitely will ripen, and it really only takes one specific karmic seed, to establish that rebirth, out of the countless trillions of karmic seeds that exist in the mind. Only one has to ripen, at that particular time. And so, yeah, there's no guarantees with, with karma, unfortunately. The best we can do is, to just try as hard as we can to avoid creating as, negative karma, as much as possible, and then to purify as much negative karma as we also can, given however much time and effort we can put into that. And then, of course, it's really just hoping, and well, not hoping, because hope is not a strategy, but you know, um, directing ourselves toward seeing emptiness directly. Making effort into seeing emptiness directly, and with the goal of trying to do that in this life if possible. Um, but okay. So day 211, Lama Zopa, the quotation is, "We cannot start to overcome suffering until we understand it." And this was something that we touched upon in the last class, because Lama Zopa went into the Four Noble Truths there and also here. The first of which is the true suffering. He says, which the Buddha says must be understood. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering, which he says must be abandoned or renounced. So that's why renunciation is turning away from suffering. The third is the cessation of suffering, which is to be attained by means of the fourth noble truth, the path leading to the cessation of suffering, which must be practiced. So that which must be understood, that which must be abandoned, that which must be cultivated or attained, and that which must be practiced. Um, so he says, to renounce suffering, we must know what it is and understand its cause. If a doctor were to give us some medicine but not explain what our illness was, we'd see no purpose in taking the medicine. This is why the Buddha explained the truth of suffering first, followed by its cause. So, the very first contemplation was we need to see, day 209, the first of this section was we need to see samsara as a raging fire, as opposed to a pleasure grove. That's not in the quotation, but that's the other traditional analogy of what ordinary sentient beings, non-Aryas, that's kind of the difference there, is that Aryas do see it. They look at samsara, cyclic existence, and that is what they see. They see only suffering. Ordinary sentient beings look at samsara and they see a pleasure grove. They see, for the most part, and of course, um, some people are probably quite oppressed by suffering and they don't see it that way. But many people would look at it and say, on balance, this is pretty good. This is, it's not perfect, but without being able to directly observe for ourselves something better, we kind of settle and we think, well, it's not an animal, it's not, and so it's pretty good. And so we kind of crave, and so at death, we um, experience, ordinary sentient beings, we would experience death as the loss of that continuity, that the falling away of what we have known, what we've experienced, what we're enjoying, to some degree, even if it's just because there's other people that are still present, and we might be in some pain and whatnot, but still, we might have friends or family or something that we find fulfilling, and we are recognizing that that is all slipping away. And then there's very strong craving and grasping that gets activated at that moment for the ordinary sentient beings, and that is what is going to lead to a ordinary karmic seed being ripened into further samsara, further experiences that kind of find it intolerable that this is slipping away, that this is something that we're being forcibly separated from. Um, but if we overcome that craving and grasping by in part developing this really strong renunciation that, this section is deepening for us, then, we don't see the need to continue to participate in ordinary cyclic existence. We're like, okay, well, yeah, this is falling away, but that's fine. There's nothing valuable to cling on to. And of course, the more that we're supported in the previous contemplations, because we shouldn't expect to master the middle scope until we've mastered the small scope. And so just becoming familiar with death, the death meditation, and that we recognize that in a way it's a bit silly to fight against what can't be otherwise. We are separating from the body, we are separating from our relationships and whatever else at that moment, and so it serves no purpose to um, to find that distressing, just like it would if we found it distressing that the sun was going to rise tomorrow. That would be a mental illness. We would be taken to the doctor and be given medication, and people would be deeply concerned, because we have no control over the reality of that. But we also have no control over the reality of the separation of the body and mind at death. And yet people find it pretty normal, to negatively react to that inevitability, that which is also fully and completely unavoidable. But from the Buddhist perspective, they're not really different. They're both irrational, and we can overcome that irrationality, by deeply understanding and also recognizing that that it's sort of an illusion that something real is falling away, because the mind isn't ceasing. The mind is simply moving from one kind of experience into another kind of experience. And the more that we practice the dissolutions, in meditation, the more familiar we become with the signs, of death, and potentially the less distressing and uncertain and strange it would be experienced when it does actually arise at death. Because it's like, oh yeah, this is what I've done hundreds and hundreds of times before in meditation, and like, oh, now this is happening, and now this is happening, and like, it's not kind of like when you go in. I remember, I've had a number of surgeries and things, and the doctors, they'll kind of come in and they'll be like, okay, that we're gonna start with this, and it's gonna feel like this. And when they do that really well, you can be calm, you can be, because they're like, oh yeah, you told me that this was gonna happen, and now it's happening. um, so that's kind of the same sort of a thing. We're preparing the mind in that way. um, so that is also a really supportive meditation. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the in the death process, in the dissolution that's been described pretty well, I think. And I've also read that it's, and I don't know if this is for people who aren't practicing Buddhism, but that it's um, very trippy, and there's a lot of hallucinating, and it's scary, and it's this and it's that. So part of what we're doing is to train our minds to recognize these, so we're not freaked out. Basically,
Yeah,
the way.
so that's more so like in the Bardo experience. After the mind of clear light, finishes and we enter the intermediate state, we enter the Bardo. That's kind of generally, for the most part, when there's all kinds of these karmic appearances, and it can be like, weird sounds and weird visions, um, and I think there's, to some degree, like you're saying, a connection between the kind of karma that's ripening, and so Um, it certainly could be that, I mean, if we do die as a relatively ordinary, person, then it is a really dramatic change for the mind to be separated from this particular system, energy system, and to go. And so it seems like it's to some degree just kind of like what happens when the mind separates from the body in that kind of very jarring way, that kind of really dramatic state change. Um, but certainly it could be that if we're capable of entering meditation, maybe, of course, depends on how lucky we are, with what happens, whether it's a car crash or whether it's, something slow. Um, and of course, it's not luck, it's karma, but still, there's only so much we can do to like pick what's going to happen. Um, but if we can have a really calm mind and a really concentrated mind from the beginning of that process all the way through the the leaving of the body, the separation after the mind of clear light finishes, um, then certainly could be that that experience would be more pleasant, less fearful, um, but recognizing whatever arises in the bardo is still kind of an illusory karmic appearance, whether it's frightening or kind of peaceful. Still, it's a karmic appearance, and I haven't really received a lot of, or maybe any, real teachings on, maybe one, maybe Dalek Rinpoche. He taught on the bardo one, but that was like just one time. Um, like how to hold the mind actually in the bardo. That's probably pretty challenging. Aside from, because you would want to generally try to remember virtue. You would generally want to try to remember um, positive, loving kindness, supportive, positive states of mind, and try to, because if you're in the bardo, then you're going to take rebirth, and you would want to try to be activating a really positive karmic seed. And, in a way that karmic seed is sort of being determined throughout the death time, the whole death kind of process leading up to entering the bardo. So it's really critically important to also and focus, and we have a probably more control to some degree over that in terms of, um, again, if it's a slower process, we have control to some degree over the people who are there, the things that are being said, the sounds that we're hearing, the supportive kind of environment that's being created, the mantras and the prayers and all of, we have control over that process, hopefully, if it goes well. And that can really help to activate a positive karma during that process. Once you're actually, everything is done and you're now just in the bardo, aside from, as you're saying, trying to not get caught up in the appearances, um, I guess that's maybe the best advice that I've heard, is just to not get overwhelmed or caught up, or reactive to the experiences that are arising, and to try to hold the mind to recollect prayers or positive aspirations or something, or refuge, or the Buddha, one's teacher, whatever kind of supportive positive things that could be kind of focused on at that time. Don't know how difficult that is once you're actually fully in the bardo.
Right. Something tells me that it's going to take a lot of practice to maintain a calm mind. You know, when your body's, well, anyway, I just think it's yeah.
So does through a POA practice,
Sorry, you're freezing. Sorry, I missed what you said. You were frozen there
yeah,
for.
That's us.
that's us. Go to the Pure Lands.
Does POA practice?
So I was just going to say, if you are adept at POA practice, is it possible to actually skip the bardo?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, there's a variety of different, there's Amitabha practice, which is different. That's kind of the easiest um, sort of meditational practice of the Pure Lands. Amitabha is said to kind of have the lowest bar to entry for more so ordinary beings. So practicing Amitabha, is a very common thing that people do. And then, yeah, I haven't gotten any teachings at all on POA practice, but that is the point of it, is to be kind of forcefully kind of just ejected into. I've heard, anecdotes of practice, that are sort of historical anecdotes where anecdotes where sort of people, because it's from what I understand, like I said, I've received no teachings on it, but I think the visualizations are relatively complex, and it requires maybe a relatively high degree of concentration, and so there are factors, and then there's also pain arising and so on. So there are these historical anecdotes where people were like, "Oh well, yeah, I had thought that that was going to be my plan, but then I had to abandon, that, and then I just focused on refuge. I just focused on, and that, then I accomplished, the same purpose by focusing on just holding my mind in pure refuge, because that was easier to do than these complicated, um, but like I said, I've received no teachings on POA practice myself. So,
Thank you.
okay. So so day 211, that's the whole point of the middle scope and parts of the small scope is not to focus on coarse suffering or subtler suffering to be morbid, but to without that deep understanding, we won't um, look at the deeper causes. And if we don't look at the deeper causes, we won't look at the deeper antidotes, the subtler antidotes. And if we don't look at the subtler antidotes, we won't look at the subtler practices that generate those antidotes. So if our understanding of suffering remains at a coarse level, then which is what it is for a non-practitioner, for an ordinary, because when you say the Four Noble Truths, it's true suffering, um, true origins, true cessation, and true paths is one way of saying it, rather than the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin, the truth, but to say true suffering, true origin, true, because ordinary beings also have a mistaken or a misguided understanding of the Four Noble Truths, the Four Ordinary Truths, you could say, the Four Typical Truths. We think that suffering is just poverty and disease and, physical pain, mental distress, and that's it. That's all we think of it as. And so we try to pursue wealth and status and education, because we think that that will hold us back from experiencing homelessness and poverty and disease. If we eat well, if we exercise, if we have enough money in the bank, um, and that's, comparatively speaking, no one's saying that that's not a bad idea. Better to not be homeless than to be homeless. Better to be, have a clear, healthy body than, a really unhealthy, just junk food kind of addicted body. Relatively, comparatively speaking, no one's arguing that. But you'll do nothing to address cyclic existence or these subtler things if your understanding of suffering doesn't also become subtler, because then you get interested in what are the reasons for this subtler suffering. You get interested in what are the antidotes to this subtler suffering, and you get interested in what are the practices that will cause those antidotes to dawn in my own mind, to put an end to these subtler sufferings. And so that's why the first noble truth is to be understood, as Lama Zopa is quoting the Buddha. We must understand the true suffering in order to be able to practice the other noble truths.
You mentioned mental sufferings in your list of sufferings for most people, and tell me if I'm off here, but are not the more subtle sufferings mostly mental?
Yeah, I mean, it's just compared to what? I mean, yes, if you're only talking about, if you were to class all of, I mean, it just depends on where on the spectrum, because, um, you know, um, getting a paper cut isn't fun. No one enjoys that. So that is a suffering. Um, but but it's certainly coarser or grosser, um, than anything that might happen solely in the mind. Um, so if you were to pick the realm in which all of the sufferings happened before you got to a suffering that was, I don't know, substantially, because within the mental sufferings, of course, there's still a spectrum. Um, there's just the thought, just the thought that we need more, just the thought that we're never satisfied. That's a pretty subtle, most people don't even really recognize, most practitioners, I mean, most humans really never recognize that, like, all of the time we're dissatisfied about, like, the ache here, or the amount of light in the room, or, kind of, oh, I could drink something, I could eat something, or so just that's a pervasive dissatisfaction that's kind of always with us. Is that the subtlest kind of mental event that's classified as a suffering? I don't know. Maybe. I'm not sure. Um, but then, yeah, so I mean, anything that could happen in the body would be, and then of course you have to look at the relationship between what is happening in the body and how it's being interpreted by the mind. Because the reason that something that's happening in the body or happening in the mind is painful is because of how it's being interpreted by the mind, how it's being experienced by the mind. So a physical suffering isn't a suffering if you interpret it as a purification and you're like thrilled. You could be thrilled that you get it. Like if you do a lot of purification practice and then you get a migraine, you might be overjoyed that you have a migraine, and you might be like, oh, this, whereas under normal circumstances, you might see that as a real sign of progress. And you may be like, oh, this really means that my practice is effective. And I just purified something that was going to cause me to spend eons in the hell realms. And that's gone forever now. So it could be a blissful experience for a certain kind of person.
So are mental afflictions are there more subtle sufferings than mental afflictions?
Maybe, I mean, since fundamental ignorance is the root of all suffering, then maybe you could say just concretizing, just is because that gives rise to the experience of things as pleasurable or unpleasurable. The fact that when we observe something, we mistakenly understand it to exist from its own side, rather than as a dependent arising. You could say that the fact that as an ordinary sentient being, we're never separated, even in our dreams, even we're never separated from that mistaken way of relating. And that could be a suffering that maybe is even subtler than pervasive dissatisfaction, because without it, none of the other afflictions are possible. And the view of pleasant and unpleasant arises simultaneous with that concretization of, when the delicious food is in front of us, it's delicious because we concretize it and we think it's separate from me and it possesses its own quality of deliciousness. And then in the next moment, craving and grasping arises to the delicious food. Or if it's, a pile of, like a dead cat or something, and we're like, oh, that's hideous. That, in that first moment, we've concretized it as, you know, inherently aversive, and we instantaneously in the very next mental moment have this painful aversion. So I mean, kind of the fact that we're powerless to avoid concretizing maybe is a suffering, compared to, because everything really is compared to the bliss of liberation. Everything is compared to what's possible, what we're not experiencing. That's what suffering is, really. It's just in relation to what is better than this, which is why we can say, well, the hell realms are the worst kind of suffering, well, only in comparison to the other kinds of suffering. And the other kinds of suffering are lesser only in comparison to the worst kinds of suffering. And all of that is only in comparison to the fact that enlightenment exists. If enlightenment didn't exist, then we really couldn't say that, the formless realm we'd all just want to get to the formless realm. And we'd be like, well, yeah, eons in the formless realm is kind of the best you can do, so let's just do that. And then, yeah, it's going to end, but then we'll try to get back there, and we'll just keep trying to spend as much time in the formless realm. That would kind of be the point, because it's all just in comparison to something else. And that's all the Buddha said. The Buddha said, ordinary sentient beings, they just get more of this. Enlightened beings, they also have mind. Their mind is also beginningless and endless. And yet they just have a different experience. They just get more of something else. And it's just comparatively, it's better. When you look at one versus you look at the other, you would choose the one that's comparatively better. And that's all the Buddha is really encouraging us to do, is saying, well, given that this is a thing, do that instead of this.
So a fully enlightened being can manifest itself in endless nirmanakaya forms. Is that correct?
I don't know. I mean, it's certainly,
Or in necessary or in needed nirmanakaya forms?
yeah, in a way, in I don't know if the word endless, there's it could be. I don't really know if they characterize, because I mean, prior to fully enlightened beings, there's like specific characterizations. If you're a bodhisattva on the first ground, if you're on the second ground, like your ability to emanate becomes quantifiably different. Um, Enlightened beings, it could be that it truly is like, but I'm just not sure what the right technical word is, or if there is one. Certainly it's an incredibly high number, but to some degree, the there are limitations that are based on the karma of, which is, for example, why there aren't just wheel turning, but as, I mean, there are enlightened beings on the earth, but the supreme Nirmanakaya form of a wheel turning Buddha, that's a very special karmic thing. And that's why it's not kind of just happening all of the time, because it really depends on that karmic relationship. And so, to some degree, the sentient beings, kind of have to have the right kind of karma. I mean, this it could be that the enlightened beings are there, um, the story of you know I guess, was it the story the was it Milarepa who did the 3-year retreat and then saw, um, so, that story of, or no, it's like 10 years of retreat. That practitioner that did 10 years of retreat, wanting to have a vision of an enlightened being, and only after, 10 years, and then there was the maggots on the dog, and he lifted the maggots with his tongue, because he didn't want to hurt the dog, but he also didn't want to hurt the maggots. And it was really only at that time when, due to having done 10 years of retreat, solitary, serious retreat, he had trained his mind to be able to give rise. And then he was able to see, I think it was Maitreya that he was trying to see, to see. So, and Maitreya was like, well, I've been here the whole time, but you couldn't see me, because you didn't have the right karma. So in order to actually be benefited, and actually to kind of, so therefore, I mean, they are emanating, but to actually receive the benefit of those emanations, it is sort of an interdependent kind of a thing too. But yeah, that's the main advantage of an enlightened form over a being who's achieved lower nirvana. They're both in perfect peace for themselves. They're both beyond suffering, but a lower nirvana being is not able to re-enter cyclic existence at all for the benefit of ordinary sentient beings. Whereas a fully enlightened being is able to create those emanations. Um, and and so, of course, they still rely on that interdependence in order for that to be, um, but they can maybe shape things in subtler ways. Like, maybe they manifest as some sort of influential politician, or some other, and they kind of shape culture in various ways, but to really be, to see them, to see their actual form, to see, and to be, benefited in subtler ways, that is, to take teachings, from them in subtler ways, and to really be benefited in those subtler, more energetic ways, that really requires that we clear away a lot of the veils that are in our own mind that are preventing that. Um, so the ways in which they, to some degree, they're limited in the tools that they have for sentient beings. They're emanating and they're doing things, but their tools are kind of limited because we're not able to perceive that in the same way.
It makes me think of hearing, that there are emanations that are inanimate, and I guess the thought that just went through my mind was, that really we're responding to everything all the time, whether it's a rock that we stub our toe on and how we respond to that, or that, I mean, maybe this is a little woo-woo, but that the emanations maybe are there for us all the time, and we're just always responding to an emanation. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it could, I mean, as a mind training, it's a really useful way to think.
Or a little weird.
Well, I mean, if you hold the view that everyone around you is enlightened and they're trying to get you enlightened, and they're trying, everything that they're doing is just to awaken you, then that really does. I mean, I wouldn't recommend telling other people that and, going around. But if you hold that just internally, it really shifts how you would respond. It's kind of like everyone is your own root guru in that way. Like, would you respond, if how would you interpret maybe a strong statement from your root guru? You might have the training in your mind to see that in a charitable way, and think, oh well, he or she is really just trying to wake me up here. And so, but you don't have it's more difficult to see that charitably from a stranger. But if you can see both of those people as emanations, then maybe you benefit.
It reminds me of, we do a practice on Friday nights, and the very last couple of lines in it is that we come back into this world in a form that we're able to benefit sentient beings. We've gone through this whole practice anyway. We come back in a form that we're able to benefit sentient beings, and we see the world as a Buddha field, and all communication, all words as communicating knowledge, and all objects as everything as objects, as offerings to the awakening mind. And sometimes that confuses me, and sometimes I get it, because it's just such a vast concept, to see everything and everyone and everything you do in that context. So I think we've taken up your whole hour.
Well, you're the only ones here, so that's how it's supposed to go.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think we'll end there for today. So we'll end with dedication. So again, we recollect our altruistic motivation and think that by listening and contemplating, participating, we've actualized that motivation, created positive energy in the mind, which will ripen in beneficial ways. And we want that to ripen particularly in ways that support our spiritual growth and development. So just think in your own mind how you want your own karma to ripen, and very strongly dedicate it as such. Well, I will see you hopefully on Thursday.